I think over the last day, it's pretty clear, and last day, I should say last 10, 15 years, that the world has to decarbonize, but also that it needs trillions of dollars of investment. The two questions that I'll focus on in this brief talk is the transition going to be fast and orderly or slow and disorderly? I think it makes a difference to our grandchildren. And what will it take for businesses to really invest in these new opportunities that these trillions of dollars of investment will create? I'm Rajat Gupta. I come from the physical world of polluters. For 20 years at McKinsey, have been serving the steel companies, the power companies, the oil companies. But I might say arguably my highest impact piece of work in these 30 years at McKinsey has been to set up the Indian solar mission. It's a short piece of work, but as a result partly of that and partly the tailwinds that came, India is the third largest renewables market as a result of this in the world. I have three messages for you today. First, from a perspective of energy and materials, which is a large part of the carbon that's out there in the atmosphere and the carbon that has to be abated, the economic and demand signals for that have been unlocked. Not uniformly, but they have certainly been unlocked, and they've been getting unlocked over the last maybe 20 years. Some of the recent facts around this, the 90+% of the countries comprising the world's 90% of the world's GDP, 2,000 plus companies, banking assets worth $130 trillion have all committed to getting to net zero somewhere between 30, 40, and 50 years from now. And this and action over the last decades has unlocked transition. I'll give you 3 or 4 examples of this. So in India, for example, two-wheeler battery-operated vehicles are in the money. The capital cost is higher than it is for ICE vehicles, but the two-wheeler vehicles are in the money, and they cost per kilometer on a lifetime basis half or even 1/3 of what a petrol-driven vehicle would cost. Now, some of this is fortuitous, battery cost declining, but the fortuitous part of it is that today there's an imputed carbon tax on transportation fuels in India of $150 per ton. I mean, this is not a known fact, right? So India taxes, or Indian government taxes fuel to raise money for food, subsidies, for infrastructure building, for government services. But the unknown effect of that is $150 to $200 per ton of carbon dioxide, carbon tax effectively on transportation fuels. This is, just compare it to $80 to $100 of EU ETS. So this opportunity has been unlocked. If you look at what the Chinese companies are doing, LONGi, the battery companies, they've spotted the opportunity and they're getting out there with these opportunities. They're dominating the world with manufacturing. If you look at the European steel sector, as a result of the EU ETS and increasing prices of carbon, as well as the reducing allowances, the free allowances that they used to get, they have announced billions of dollars in investment in green steel. So by the end of this decade, there'll be 20, 30 million tons of green steel that Europe could potentially be producing. Another one is recycled plastics. If you look at recycled PET, polypropylene, polyethylene, these recycled materials are trading at 30 to 60% premium over virgin materials. And that's because consumer companies are demanding a certain proportion of recycled materials. So the demand signals, the economics for many of these things have indeed been unlocked. So my second message, or perhaps question, is then, is this enough? There's only 500 billion tons or thereabouts of carbon space that's left for a 1.5 degree pathway. We will exhaust this by the end of this decade. These actions, these areas that I described, are useful but wholly inadequate for us to be on that 1.5 or even a 2.5 degree pathway. Let's turn to countries. Countries have set 2050, 60, 70 targets. They've even set 2030 targets. The country that we are in, Japan, has a target to reduce its absolute emissions by 46% relative to 2018. India has an aspiration or target to reduce its relative emissions or emissions intensity by 45% by, again, 2030. So countries have set short-term targets. So these targets are not only long-term, but they've set short-term targets. What they have not done is to provide uniform stimulus to be able, for companies to be able to invest in a uniform manner across all the areas that need investment to occur. So let's take Japan as an example, then I'll talk about a few others. Carbon markets have not really been created yet. And the discussion in the market is to create carbon markets, which will be voluntary to start with, to create a bit of a taste for these carbon markets. The expectation is that they will move to compliance markets with $10 to $20 a ton of carbon price. Look at the two-wheeler market in India. It took a $150 carbon tax to get it to be in the money. Right? So that's the magnitude of difference that's out there. Indonesia has put a carbon tax, $3. India is talking about a voluntary carbon market. It's a perform, achieve, trade scheme. But it's given no timeline for a compliance carbon market. So the reason is obvious. The poor have to be protected against inflation. These are also very complicated issues in the sense that the regulation on this is very difficult. While there's a bit of a track record of the EU ETS over the last 10, 15 years, these are complicated regulations. Putting them in place is quite difficult. Now, without these targets, 2030 targets, 2050 targets, being converted into policies, industrial policies that companies can then rely on and invest behind, the investment won't come. And that's because investment here in this case is billions and tens of billions. We've been hearing that all of yesterday and today. It's not the tens of millions or the hundreds of millions that, for example, a digital business takes to create. But a green steel business requires $4 to $10 billion of investment. And that magnitude of investment will not come unless the economic and demand signals are clear and the policies are steady. That's another problem. In countries like India, policies are stated, but they are not steady. By the way, we've seen signs of this underinvestment already. The scramble for coal in India 3 months ago, the gas prices in Europe, albeit exacerbated by the war currently. And if investment doesn't come in the clean tech areas and simultaneously is likely to be choked in the gray areas, we are likely to see high and volatile energy and material prices. High and volatile energy and material prices, and hence a disorderly transition. So what can be done? That's my message 3. Both businesses have to do things, but perhaps the starting point is indeed governments, stimulated by businesses. Governments have to translate 2030 targets to carbon prices and other industrial policies, which will open up investment, which will make the financiers amongst here comfortable to invest behind these ideas. Companies need to then respond to the stimulus. They have to build new businesses. Each of these investments is a new business. You're basically taking away a coal-based power plant and you're building a solar or renewables business, or you're taking away a gray steel plant and you're replacing it effectively with a green steel business, or you're creating a recycled plastic businesses. So there are immense number of new businesses to be created here, and that's the big opportunity. There are 3 types of companies, and at some level there is a bit of possible focus here. These 3 types of companies or businesses comprising only 20% of the world's GDP. That's where the change needs to be the most. It's only 20% of the world's GDP that needs to change. It needs to be stimulated by the other 80%, but let me focus for a moment on the 20%. 3% of the world's GDP, fossil fuel producers, coal miners, oil producers. They have to, of course, change their portfolio. They will be generating, if you believe what I said a minute ago, huge amounts of surpluses. So these companies have to reinvest these surpluses into newer technologies or newer ways of providing power, or alternatives to liquid fuels like biofuels. So they have to invest. 3% of the world's GDP, fossil fuel producers have to invest and change their portfolios. Carbon generators, steel companies, cement companies, agri-producers, food producers, 12% of the world's GDP. They have to undergo changes in technology. So something as simple as, instead of flooding-based rice production, systematic intensification of rice, dry rice production, or in the case of cement, the use of biomass, much higher levels of biomass, or alternate materials for cement, or for steel, hydrogen-based steel production, again, ripping out plants and replacing them. So technologies have to change for this 12% of the world's GDP. And then there are the product companies that build products that pollute, industrial machinery, which uses fuel, or car companies that have tailpipe emissions, 5% of the world's GDPs. They have to undergo product transformation. Of course, all of this stimulated by what I said first. The government's signals have to come, because in many cases, the technologies aren't yet there for this to be economic relative to the alternate that's there. So the government's signals have to come. Companies, and maybe the balance 70% of the world's GDP or 80% of the world's GDP has to put pressure backwards onto these companies. So just as an example, 11% of the world's GDPs are the big buyers of carbon, non-electricity buyers of carbon. This is food, FMCG food companies, consumer durable companies, car companies. They have embedded carbon in the car. These are construction companies, some of you are here, 11% of the world's GDP. They have to insist on buying green materials and green energy, and the rest of the 70% of the world's GDP is largely an energy consumer. Now, one other factoid on why businesses should be acting on this. So for those businesses which have acted 5, 10, 15 years ago on this, and where technologies and economics have matured somewhat, the market to book of these businesses is 3x that of either businesses that have not moved or businesses where the transition hasn't started occurring. So it's 4.5x for, let me call them green companies, producing green energy and green materials, and it's 1.5x for gray materials and gray energy companies. So there's real money to be made here. Maybe in closing, many of the sectors or enablers that will make these investments happen are here. Investors, infrastructure providers, builders, regulators also, some of them. We can ensure that this transition is orderly and value creating if we can all dance in concert. And if we do, then we obviously leave behind a better world for our children and our grandchildren. As McKinsey, we are here to help. We aspire to be the largest private catalyst. We can't be the largest catalyst. The governments will be that. But we aspire to be the largest private catalyst for the decarbonization of the world. And we will be investing $2 billion in this endeavor over the next few years. And thank you very much.